Autumn 1941. The strategic situation on the Soviet-German front reached its peak crisis. The German Operation Typhoon, aimed at capturing the capital, was developing with terrifying speed. In early October, powerful Wehrmacht strikes resulted in the encirclement and destruction of enormous Red Army forces near Vyazma and Bryansk. The road to Moscow was open. From October 10 to 15, reports of the advance of German tank spearheads sowed panic in the capital. Everyone realized that the Germans could be at the city in a matter of days. October 16 went down in history as the Great Moscow Panic. That day, a mass, disorganized evacuation began. Government offices, factories, diplomatic missions, theaters, thousands of people hastily fled the city. Chaos reigned at train stations, roads, and in the metro. Officials, party workers, and the management of key enterprises fled the capital, leaving behind a sense of abandonment and doom. Moscow was deserted, but the tension reached its breaking point. Although Stalin remained in the Kremlin, which was publicly announced and carried enormous moral significance, behind the closed doors of the State Defense Committee, GKO, decisions were being made no less dramatic than the very fact of the city's possible surrender. If Moscow could not be held, it must not fall to the enemy. The decision to mine Moscow was not an act of fear, it was the ultimate implementation of the Soviet scorched earth principle. The primary strategic objective was as follows: deprive the enemy of resources, destroy all factories, power plants, bridges, railways, and warehouses to make Moscow impossible for the Wehrmacht to use as a rear base. Psychological impact: even if the Germans entered the city, they would face not triumph, but hell. The detonation of symbolic and key objects was intended to be an act of defiance and a constant source of terror. Isolation of the occupiers: make the restoration of infrastructure by the occupiers as difficult and time-consuming as possible. The key and secret decision to begin total mining was made personally by Stalin and members of the State Defense Committee. The operation, unprecedented in scale, required absolute secrecy, as information about the mining could provoke even greater panic among the remaining population. Responsibility for its implementation was assigned to two agencies: the main Military Engineering Directorate, GVIU, of the Red Army and special NKVD groups experienced in sabotage and clandestine operations. The mining operation received code names or working titles, which were kept strictly confidential. A special mining brigade was created and the best engineers and sappers were recruited. Operation objectives: industrial giants, the hammer and sickle plant, ZIS, Stalin plant, now ZIL, Kochik, and all other enterprises that could be used by the Germans. Transport infrastructure: all bridges across the Moscow River, railway junctions, major train stations, and tunnels. Energy and utility facilities: water supply stations, power plants, thermal power plants, and communication systems. Symbolic and cultural sites: the most shocking part of the plan. Historic buildings such as the Bolshoi Theater, the Central Telegraph, the State Bank, and several key Moscow metro stations were mined. Sappers worked in the Kremlin and important government buildings. The mining was carried out in several stages. Delayed action bombs, surprise mines, and radio-controlled mines were planted. The main stockpile of explosives used was colossal, tens, if not hundreds, of tons of TNT, ammonal, and other explosives. Some of the explosive devices had dual redundancy, a conventional fuse and a radio-controlled fuse to ensure detonation on command from outside. The work was carried out around the clock, under cover of night, to avoid attracting the attention of the population and, more importantly, detection by German intelligence. Many workers involved in the mining were unaware of the ultimate goal of their work. They simply moved boxes and installed the equipment, on the instructions of NKVD officers. To ensure the total destruction of the facilities, a guaranteed detonation was required. It was impossible to rely solely on clockwork mechanisms, which could be detected and neutralized by German sappers. The main tools of the Scorched Earth campaign were controlled minefields and, most importantly, radio-controlled land mines. The operation of laying radio mines was supervised by special NKVD sapper and sabotage teams. Remote detonation system. During this period, the USSR was actively developing and implementing remote detonation systems. Mines laid in the foundations of buildings and under bridges were equipped with receivers. The command to detonate the explosives was to come from outside, from deep in the rear, where the operators and transmitting radios had been evacuated. Operating principle: the explosives were in standby mode. Upon receiving a special coded radio signal on a specific frequency, transmitted from a great distance, up to 300 kilometers or more, the detonator would detonate. Secrecy: the frequency and code of the signal changed daily and were known only to a select few. The risk was twofold: a leak of information could lead to the disruption of the entire operation, and the capture of the receivers could provide the Germans with cutting-edge technology. NKVD sappers worked under strict isolation. The exact number of radio-controlled explosive devices installed remains a secret, but it is known that they were planted under high-priority targets. This was a system designed not simply to destroy, but to inflict maximum psychological and material damage on the enemy as they triumphantly entered the capital. The Moscow metro was one of the most sensitive and strategically important mining targets. Why the metro? Transportation hub. The metro could have been used by the Germans for rapid troop movements, evacuation, as a bomb shelter, and as a convenient command post. Effect of the Holocaust: blowing up key stations and tunnels would have led to the collapse of entire city districts, flooding underground utilities, and causing unprecedented chaos. Symbol: the metro was a symbol of the USSR's achievements. Its destruction would have been a powerful blow to Soviet ideology. Mining operations were carried out on key sections and stations, especially those located deep and crucial for connecting the center with the outskirts. Sappers worked, concealing explosives in cable shafts, utility rooms, and under the tracks. According to the recollections of those who participated in the work, the order to mine the metro was one of the most difficult. Many of the metro workers, who had barely completed these stations, were now forced to prepare them for destruction. Water and sewer systems were also prepared for detonation, so that after detonation, flooding would turn the central districts into impassable ruins. The most dramatic aspect of the operation was the mining of cultural and historical symbols. The decision taken by the State Defense Committee demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice heritage to deny the enemy victory. Mining targets. Bolshoi Theater. Mining, one of the world's most important cultural centers, was intended to symbolize that in this war there was no place for values other than struggle. Central Telegraph, State Bank, Lenin Library. The destruction of these sites was critical to disrupting the administration and economy. The Kremlin, the historical, political, and sacred center of Russia and the USSR, was also prepared for a partial, but critical, demolition. The main towers and key buildings within the Kremlin were ready to detonate, denying the enemy the opportunity to plant their flag on them or use them as headquarters. The sappers who mined the Kremlin and the Bolshoi Theater carried out their duty with the knowledge that they were committing an act of historical vandalism in the name of saving the country. The tension in those days was incredible. Every change on the front, every German breakthrough, brought the moment when the signal to detonate the Kremlin closer. The people responsible for transmitting this signal lived in a state of constant combat readiness, knowing that the fate of the ancient city lay in their hands. While the sappers, under cover of night, turned the heart of the country into one giant land mine, the greatest battle for the fate of the Soviet Union unfolded on the approaches to the city. By the end of November 1941, the situation remained critical. German units reached Yakroma and Krasnaya Polyana. Only 25 to 30 kilometers separated them from Moscow. Critical point. This was the moment when the hour for carrying out the demolition order had arrived. The GKO leadership was ready to issue the fateful order to prevent the capture of strategic facilities. The absence of this order during the most difficult days was due solely to the steadfastness of the troops and the genius of the Western Front commander, Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. Zhukov, who assumed command at a critical moment, demonstrated unparalleled rigor, organizational talent, and an ability to take risks. He pulled together the last reserves, including fresh, well-equipped Siberian and Far Eastern divisions, transferred after confirmation that Japan would not attack the USSR. He demanded that the soldiers stand firm, knowing that behind them lay empty space and planted mines. Cancellation of the order. A historic turning point occurred on December 5 to 6, 1941, when the Red Army, mustering its last strength, launched a counteroffensive. Severe frosts, the Germans' unpreparedness for a winter campaign, and, most importantly, the fierce resistance of the Soviet troops, broke the Wehrmacht's offensive momentum. The Germans were pushed back tens, then hundreds, of kilometers from the capital. With every kilometer the Red Army recaptured, the tension around the mined installations eased. The order to detonate the mines was suspended and then, as the front advanced, gradually rescinded. However, the very fact of such self-sacrifice remained one of the darkest secrets of the war. The Germans were not naive. They were well aware of the Soviet scorched earth tactics, which were widely used during the retreat in Ukraine and Belarus. German counterintelligence and sapper units had a clear mission: immediately upon entering Moscow, begin an operation to locate and defuse all explosive devices. Search methods. Informants. The primary source was to be local residents and, possibly, traders who could point to suspicious work or planting sites. Technical resources. German sappers used their own mine detectors, more sophisticated than Soviet ones, to check key transportation hubs and large buildings. The Germans paid particular attention to radio mines. They were aware of the existence of Soviet remote detonation systems, including similar ones developed by Soviet engineers, which were used, for example, in Kiev. Therefore, in the occupied territories, the Germans jammed radio signals and attempted to detect signals. Their efforts were not in vain. In some cities not held by the Red Army, for example, Kiev, the Germans managed to find and defuse Soviet land mines. Therefore, the sappers who mined Moscow had an additional task: to make detection as difficult as possible, using multiple layers of camouflage, concrete-encased charges, and various types of detonators. Behind this massive operation stood people whose psychological burden was perhaps the heaviest. These were small groups of sappers and NKVD operators who remained in the half-empty, mined city. Their task was simple and terrifying: wait. Psychology of isolation. These people were cut off from the main forces, often hiding in basements or technically camouflaged rooms near the mine sites. They were the last line of defense. Burden of decision. Imagine a group commander sitting at his transmitter or the main detonation cable. In his hands was a switch that could turn a centuries-old city, his own home, into a mountain of rubble. This wasn't just a military order, it was a personal burden, an act of supreme self-sacrifice. The immense relief these teams felt at the end of December, when it became clear that Moscow had held and the order to detonate it wouldn't come, is indescribable. It was precisely thanks to their dedication and willingness to see the plan through to completion that the plan worked as a strategic deterrent. With the Germans' retreat from Moscow in early 1942, the sappers faced an equally difficult and dangerous task: demoning the capital. The operation to remove the explosives dragged on for months, and in some cases, years. Difficulties of demoning. Concealment and duplication. The charges were planted with the expectation that the Germans would not detect them. They were deeply concreted into foundations, concealed in utility lines, and hidden in hard-to-reach shafts. To extract the tons of TNT, it was often necessary to dismantle the main structures. Radio-controlled mines. The greatest threat was radio-controlled land mines. Although the detonation order was cancelled, there was a risk that the radio-controlled mines could be triggered by an external signal, an electrical short, or the detonation of adjacent, unrelated charges. Sappers had to work with pinpoint precision to neutralize the receivers and remove the fuses without triggering an accidental detonation. Booby traps. Some of the explosives were planted as booby traps or surprise mines, e.g., in safes, doors, and cabinets, intended to assassinate the Wehrmacht's headquarters leadership. These devices were not part of the main plan, but posed a constant, hidden threat to the workers rebuilding the city. An invisible danger loomed over Moscow. Every time construction workers began digging or renovating old buildings, there was a risk of stumbling upon the gift of 1941. Mined objects were discovered even in the post-war years, when only a few knew about the operation itself. This required constant, quiet, and heroic work from sappers. After the front stabilized and the Germans were driven out, the plan to mine Moscow was completely classified. The Soviet government decided not to disclose the details of the operation for several reasons. Preventing panic. Information that the capital was ready to explode at any moment could have caused mistrust and panic among the population. The public needed to believe in Moscow's invincibility, not its readiness to self-destruct. Image and propaganda. Official propaganda portrayed Moscow as an impenetrable fortress, not a mined city. Admitting a willingness to destroy the Kremlin and the Bolshoi Theater could have undermined morale and given ideological opponents a competitive edge. Preservation of technology. The secrets of radio-controlled mines and camouflage techniques were invaluable military technologies that had to remain inaccessible to potential adversaries, especially in the context of the emerging Cold War. As a result, only those directly involved in the NKVD and WWII operations knew about the mined city. Many details of this grand operation began to emerge only during Perestroika and, especially, after the collapse of the USSR, when key archival documents were declassified. Only then did it become possible to reconstruct just how close Moscow came to total annihilation. The story of the mining of Moscow is one of the darkest, yet, paradoxically, most powerful symbols of an unbroken spirit. This operation, although never carried out, proved three important things. The will to resist. The country's leadership was willing to sacrifice cultural and historical treasures rather than give the enemy a symbol of victory and the resources to continue the war. Deterrent effect. Even rumors and assumptions that major cities were mined influenced the Wehrmacht's tactics, forcing them to act cautiously and divert sappers to mine hunting. Sappers' heroism. In the shadow of military parades and resounding victories, the quiet feet of engineers and sappers, prepared to commit the most horrific act in Moscow's history, remained. For the "Lest We Remember" channel, this story is the quintessential embodiment of the price paid for victory. Moscow endured not only thanks to heroism on the front lines, but also thanks to a willingness to make absolute sacrifices in the rear. Moscow did not fall in 1941. And today, looking at its Kremlin and Bolshoi Theater, we must remember, these monuments stand thanks to the resilience of the soldiers and the terrible decision made in those days. We remember not only those who fought on the walls, but also those who sat at the switch. Lest we remember.